Priestesses would be dressed in white and would go into a trance and bring through voices and prophecies to the assembled gathering. Channeling has been known by a number of different names in different cultures over the centuries, but it next rears its head in a major way with the Victorians in the last century.
Alexander Blair Ewart, editor of Dimensions magazine, has studied the resurgence of channeling and its pagan beginnings.
Trance-channeling basically emerged in the mid-1800s when science had destroyed Western religion, essentially. Something that had been repressed for about 2,000 years, which was paganism, and earlier atavistic forms of religion came gushing to the surface. So suddenly you had this pagan approach to the spirit that had been repressed for a couple of thousand years and has suddenly floated to the surface.
When mediums would sit in a seance and sit among people who came into this seance room to listen to the words of the entities who were speaking through the medium, and these entities were often Chinese and Red Indian guides. Why they prevailed, we don't know, but often the guides who spoke through, and I use the word guides in quotes, the entities who came through were often Red Indian and Chinese, and would make pronouncements about the lives of the sitters in that room, would tell them much about themselves, would be able to speak clairvoyantly about the people who are gathered around the medium. And the medium would be insensible, would be often sitting back with their eyes closed, and would just pronounce in a monotone voices. And the voices would often change as different entities would come through.
It seems that mostly people are using channeling at this stage in less of a 19th century way, where you went to get a message from your Auntie Mary who'd, passed over 10 years ago, and where the messages were very much in terms of the medium coming through and saying, I've got your Auntie Mary here and here's some advice. Now people seem to be drawing on channeling from the point of view of saying, which is why ultimately I don't think channeling is dangerous, because the way that the individual interacts with it is, and I've done a lot of research, talked to hundreds and hundreds of people, they tend to say, well, I get this kind of information from the channeled entity. I take from it what I want to use. I take from it what I feel comfortable with, and I try to develop myself spiritually through that.
I think that channeling is part of the end result of the me generation. It's people looking to see how much they can personalize themselves, how much they can get into their own things, how much they can get their own goodies, and here's another goodie they can get. But that's only a small part of it. I think a larger part of it is that you're finding in our society today a tremendous fear and anxiety and a need for some kind of authority which will give people direction.
What has drawn me to channeling is that in religious structures, they're precisely that, they're a structure. And if you're looking for a sense of security and conformity, then you go and you find their answers. But channeling is a way that helps you find your own answers. And it makes your life far more meaningful. You're not dependent on someone to tell you who you are, what you should do.
We are a culture which is now what I would call rejecting many of the assumptions that we've lived with for the past 300 years. For example, the assumption that the rational is the only way of knowing truth. And so you have that being in some ways pushed aside, and people saying, no, that there are many other ways of finding truth. And one of those ways of finding truth is to connect with another reality, a spirit reality or a spiritual reality. And so there's a searching after that.
Traditional religion never did it for me. External authority never did it for me. I always felt there was something inside there that needed to come up to the surface. So I studied altered states of consciousness. One day a friend was leading me through a meditation, and I sensed an energy in the room. And to make a long story short, the energy was very loving, very benevolent, and I got a sense that it wanted to drop in to to my body.
And this is really an introduction of what we would call a neo-paganism. It's a reintroduction into the West of beliefs that have been around for thousands upon thousands of years, that there are in fact spiritual entities and spiritual realities both in nature and outside of nature, and we can contact them. So I think all of that comes together at a time when people are very insecure, they're searching for direction, they want answers, they want certainty, but they feel all the old ways of giving answers are not appropriate. And so there are certain groups of people who are now wanting to tune in to spirits that can give them help and can give them direction.
Joe Fisher had researched metaphysics for many years before encountering the world of channeling. In his book, Fisher tells how he was invited to the home of a woman he calls Aviva, who claimed that there were entities from another dimension speaking through her. A small group of people gathered weekly to witness the various voices who would take control of Aviva.
I was so impressed with the accents, the personalities, the different languages that were produced by Aviva in her trance state, that I said to my friends, among them several journalists, you've got to see this, you've got to come to this house and witness this for yourself, which they did. And the group, by me introducing people, by these other people also introducing other people, the group swelled to close to 30 at its peak.
He phoned up and said, you know, I've found this group that meets on Friday night, and you know, it's just great, and you've got to come and see what's happening. And I think, you know, the intimation was that this was almost a secret society.
And so you can imagine there was Aviva lying down on her Chesterfield with her little pink slippers pointed towards the ceiling, going into trance, and she would switch from one voice to another, that is, different guide, so-called guide, speaking through her, as each different person in the room would speak, and they would go around the room, and they would never introduce themselves. A voice would come out, and immediately the voice that she was producing would change in accordance with the voice that asked the question.
And all of these entities, these beings, were what we would call inside of her physical body. We would see a lot of changes that would take over. It wasn't just the voices, but in being relatively close to her as these beings were coming through, I could see the difference. I could see the characteristics of these entities as they came through. Her body and particularly her face that would change.
Her eyes were closed. She couldn't see this. It was all done. I don't know how it was done. To this day, I have many questions about just what was going on. But all I know is that Laurence Olivier, on his finest day at the Old Vic, could never have produced this array of different inflections and voices and languages within a space of an hour.
Each one of us had a major guide. Like Russell was her guide, and Tuktu was mine.
And I spoke to the entity that came forward, Russell Parnick, and he described himself as a sheep farmer from the last century. That was his last incarnation. And he proceeded to tell me that I had a guide too who was looking after me on the earthbound plane, or rather the guide was in the disembodied realm. And her name was Philippa, she was Greek, that her and I had been together in Greece in the 18th century, and it was now her responsibility in this other realm to oversee my spiritual development while I was on Earth.
Fisher was intrigued by the entity claiming to be Philippa, his spirit guide. While it was speaking through Aviva, he taped the voice and took it to a linguistic specialist at the University of Toronto to verify its authenticity.
This man's name is Dr. George Thaniel, and he's a native-born Greek himself, so I thought the perfect, the linguistics professor who is a Greek by birth. He listened to 2 tapes of Philippa speaking, and he said, in part, this is a native-born Greek woman speaking. So I thought, well, there is proof that Aviva is not concocting this. She hasn't just been to the library, read some Greek, and then is making it up for me. And even if she were to learn Greek, she would be unable to speak with the voice of a native-born Greek.
With such impressive evidence, Fisher embarked on a journey to validate the claims of the guides. Had they lived previous lives?
Joe's involvement and